Good afternoon and welcome back to my channel. For a while now, I've been meaning to do a video on the history of women's suffrage. And as you know, this is an incredibly complex topic. As I've delved into it, I've realized that I'm going to need to break it up into a multi-part series. So, today we're just going to be talking about the suffragettes. Specifically, I'm going to be getting into what I was talking about in all my other videos when I referred to the suffragettes as domestic terrorists. Before we begin, let's note that the suffragettes are not to be confused with the suffragists. The suffragists were a movement made up of men and women both campaigning for the vote. The suffragettes, on the other hand, were true feminists who did not see men as allies in any way, shape, or form, and took to very violent means to get their way. As I was compiling information on this topic, I came across a piece by historian Simon Webb, and of course he did a far better job than I ever could of laying out in detail why it is that the suffragettes were domestic terrorists. So for a lot of this video, I'm going to be quoting this piece by him. Let's get right into it. Now, it's always helpful to begin by defining terms, so let's do just that. What is a domestic terrorist? Let's look at the definition here. Domestic terrorism seeks to, and I quote, 1. Intimidate or coerce a civilian population. 2. Influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion. Or 3. To affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. Now, the violence carried out by the suffragettes really isn't talked about in school textbooks, but one thing that's always brought up is the forced feedings, when the suffragettes would go on hunger strikes and threaten to starve themselves. Feminists often like to say that force-feeding these women was a brutal thing to do, except that they had threatened to starve themselves and that these politicians would have blood on their hands. So the only option was to give them the vote. This is the definition of coercion, persuading someone to do something by using force or threats. In this case, the suffragettes were threatening to kill themselves if women as a whole were not given the vote. As far as I can tell, by those actions alone, the suffragettes would have qualified as domestic terrorists under the second definition we discussed earlier, influencing the policy of a government by coercion. Today, the suffragettes are regarded as having been oh so selfless, but historian Simon Webb has this to say. He writes, even the mildest criticism of the suffragettes makes people feel uneasy. The image which we have of them today is that of selfless and patient women enduring imprisonment, hunger strikes, and the horror of force-feeding in pursuit of what was surely a just cause, that of equality of rights between men and women. Their weapons were, we've been led to suppose, those of passive resistance and peaceful protest, rather than violence against others. This popular perception is quite false. The suffragette movement was actually a terrorist organization. In the years leading up to the First World War, the suffragettes conducted a ferocious and prolonged bombing campaign across the whole of the United Kingdom, planting improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, in places as varied as Westminster Abbey, St. Paul's Cathedral, the Bank of England, the National Gallery, railway stations, and many other locations. The very first terrorist bomb to explode in Ireland in the 20th century was planted not by the IRA, but by the suffragettes. They also invented the letter bomb, designed to maim or kill those with whom they disagreed. One of the first bomb attacks carried out by the suffragettes was on the house of Chancellor of the Exchequer, Lloyd George. It went off at a little after 6 a.m. on February 19, 1913. The bomb, which brought down ceilings and cracked walls, was planted by none other than Emily Davison, who later died beneath the hooves of the King's horse at the 1913 Derby. We all know that story. There is currently talk of erecting a statue of Emmeline Pankhurst near Parliament, which is a little strange when we consider how unpopular terrorists are these days. Pankhurst was the leader of the suffragette terrorists. After the explosion at Lloyd George's house, she was brought to trial at the Old Bailey for complicity in the attack and sentenced to 3 years imprisonment. Those planning the bombings were not lone wolves or mavericks. They were being directed and supported by the suffragette leadership. The day after Mrs. Pankhurst was sent to prison, a bomb was placed outside the Bank of England. Fortunately, a policeman managed to defuse it before it detonated in the crowded street. For the next 16 months, the bomb attacks came thick and fast. Some devices, such as one planted at St. Paul's Cathedral on May 7, 1913, failed to explode. Others, such as the large device left at the Royal Observatory in Edinburgh a fortnight later, did go off, causing a great deal of damage. The wave of bombings led to a hardening in the government's position, as well as alienating those who supported the idea of a change in the law to allow women the vote. There had been every chance before the bombings began that a private member's bill to introduce the vote for women might succeed in getting through Parliament. But few politicians wished to be seen giving in to terrorism, do you think? And as a result, this bill failed even to gain a second reading. After the failure of this bill, it was plain that the suffragette bombers were harming the struggle for women's civil rights far more than they were aiding it. Throughout 1913 and the first half of 1914, the bomb attacks increased, striking places as diverse as Holloway Prison and the changing rooms at Cambridge University's football grounds. Churches became prime targets because of a perceived opposition of the Church of England to women's rights. Among the churches where bombs exploded were St. Martin in the Fields in Trafalgar Square, Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, famous for the Da Vinci Code, and on June 11, 1914, Westminster Abbey, damaging the coronation chair. The last bomb of the campaign exploded at Christ Church Cathedral in the Irish town of Lisburn on August 1, 1914. That same day, Germany declared war on Russia and then 2 days later on France. The First World War had begun. With the outbreak of the war, the suffragettes abandoned their activities and threw themselves into the war effort. The struggle to win the vote was forgotten in an upsurge of patriotic feeling. The terrorist bombings carried out by the suffragettes have today been almost wholly forgotten, replaced with a sanitized view of the activists as people who would do nothing more dangerous than break the occasional shop window. Far from hastening the granting of votes to women, the suffragettes impeded the political progress toward this aim by their dangerous actions, causing most people to reject them as violent fanatics. Had it not been for the bombings, there is every chance that the vote would have been given to women before rather than after the First World War." End quote. Now, no one who knows anything about history actually argues that these things did not happen. They are easily provable. It's historical evidence. The best that feminists and feminism-influenced education has been able to do is to simply ignore and minimize and hide it. Now, being unable to argue that these things did not occur, the best that feminists can usually do when confronted with these facts is to excuse them or justify them. So along those lines, let's address the only three arguments, if we can call them that, I would rather call them objections, that I've ever come across to the contrary. One objection is that these bombs were never intended to hurt or kill anyone. This is an objection that was raised to Simon Webb's article by Professor June Purvis, a women's studies and gender studies professor. Of course. Word to the wise, by the way, if you're wanting to know what went down in history, I would always go with the historian over the women's studies or gender studies professor. Now, Simon Webb responds to this objection. He says, she quotes Mary Lee as saying that not so much as a cat was to be harmed by their actions. This is the same Mary Lee who, acting with others, poured petrol over the carpets of a crowded theater, set fire to it, and then detonated a bomb. She and the others were later charged with, quote, causing an explosion of a nature likely to endanger life. This is precisely the same sort of charge that terrorists today might face. The women were not charged with terrorism as such because no such offense existed at that time. The bomb explosions in places such as Westminster Abbey could hardly be called anything other than terrorism. And I quite agree. When you're setting off bombs in public places and crowded places, in people's personal residences, in order to further your aims, you can insist that you are peaceful, but I'm sorry, that's a sketchy argument. The second way that feminists try to argue all of this craziness was necessary was to say that voting is such a basic human right and women deserved it, and these methods were necessary because peaceful protests did not work. First of all, voting is not a basic human right. Not even close. We will get into that topic in my next video or one of the videos after that in the series. It's not as though these women were being denied the right to their very lives or the right to free speech or anything like that. But in an effort to remove bias and be logical here, would we accept these methods, these crazy violent methods, from any other group of people campaigning for their rights, even if they were actual rights? Just as one simple, real-life, present-day example, fathers have just about no legal rights to their children just by virtue of being the father of that child. I wonder if we would accept fathers going around the country bombing courtrooms and their exes' houses as a legitimate way to protest our biased laws. For some reason, I'm thinking that would be a no. And the last and perhaps most indefensible objection is this idea that if someone is so desperate as to die for what they believe, then their cause must be just. I'm sorry, have you heard of ISIS? If you're to strap a bomb to your chest, it only shows that you're sincere. It doesn't show that you're right. You can be sincerely wrong. Well, we've barely dipped our toes in the water on this particular topic, but the intent was to establish that the suffragettes were indeed domestic terrorists. Their actions were very much in line with a lot of the so-called radical feminists that you see today. There is nothing new under the sun. Rebellion is nothing new. This spirit of Jezebel is nothing new. Feminists rearing their ugly heads against authority is nothing new, and they have rarely done it in peaceful, civil ways. Stay tuned, and in the next videos in this series, we're also going to talk a bit more about suffragettes in the US, and we're going to talk about whether voting is a right or privilege, all sorts of topics along those lines. Thank you for accompanying me on this brief sojourn back into history. As always, I value and appreciate your thoughts and your feedback. God bless you, and I'll see you next time.